The Serpent Knows, a Grayers Ferry mystery. They say the past never truly dies in Grayers Ferry, but sometimes it waits to kill. From author Dennis Mevis comes a murder mystery wrapped in silence and shadow, to the reader with a sharp eye and a steady heart. There are towns that cling to the edge of the world like forgotten thoughts, half remembered, half feared. Grayers Ferry is one such place. It does not boast its history, though it has centuries of it. It does not court visitors, though a few arrive each year and leave quickly, muttering about the mist and the odd way the townsfolk glance over their shoulders when the church bell tolls. What follows is not a ghost story, though there are ghosts of a sort. It is not merely a murder mystery either, though there is death, and not all of it dignified. This is a story about the shatter-prone silence of a small town, about the kind of secrets that harden over decades until they resemble truth, and about the unsettling echo that comes when one is finally cracked open. You will meet scholars and skeptics, gardeners and archivists, and a man who does not believe in coincidence. You will read of a death that seems benign, until it begins to unwind the town like a thread from a shroud. Grayers Ferry has always been good at keeping things buried, but the ground, you'll find, has grown restless. A town draped in fog and memory, in which the stillness of Grayers Ferry is shattered. Grayers Ferry was the kind of town that appeared as if it had been carved from the stone of another century. Its name came not from a founder, but from an accident and a rumor. In the late 1700s, a ferry operated by a man known only as Old Grayer vanished into the mist while crossing the inlet. On board were 3 oxen, a preacher and his wife, 2 crewmen, and Grayer himself. None were ever seen again. No wreckage washed ashore, just silence and speculation. They built the town around the absence and gave it his name. Tucked between the wind-bitten cliffs of coastal Maine and the iron hush of pine forests, it had endured with a certain quiet dignity. The buildings along Main Street were narrow and sloped, their windows glazed with the sea's breath and the weight of unspoken stories. Time moved differently there, not slower exactly, but deeper, the kind of time that settled in the bones. It was the sort of place where people knew the day of the week by the sound of the church bells or the smell wafting from Maribel's bakery at dawn. Children walked to school with woolen scarves wrapped tight, and adults whispered, not out of secrecy, but because in Grayers Ferry nothing stayed unknown for long. The past here moved like a breeze through lace curtains, soft, patient, impossible to hold back. You may turn your face from it, but it drifts quietly after you. Among the town's many watchful eyes, few miss the figure of Elias Finch, the recently retired literature professor from Boston, who had inherited his aunt's crumbling Victorian on Hawthorne Street. He was a peculiar man, given to long walks with a cane he didn't need, and conversations with shopkeepers that often wandered into the philosophical. His mind moved like fog over water, slow but difficult to escape once it settled. At 62, Elias was a man seeking refuge, a quiet exile after years spent unraveling the complexities of literature and human nature in Boston's restless corridors. But beneath his measured gait was a mind restless with suspicion and something else, an unease that told him Grayers Ferry was no mere retreat. It was a place where silence grew thick enough to suffocate, a place that watched. Elias Finch's cane tapped softly against the uneven cobblestones as he walked the empty streets in the pale dawn light. The sea fog clung to his coat like a second skin, curling and curling as if reluctant to release its secrets. He breathed in the damp air, feeling it fill the spaces his city lungs no longer knew. Across from Elias lived Clara Whitcomb, the local archivist and arguably the only person under 60 who still used a typewriter. Her voice always carried the clipped, precise tone of someone used to being right, and her garden was kept in military condition. Roses trained like soldiers, weeds banished like blasphemy. The two were cordial, even fond, though neither would say as much. They shared books, occasionally brandy, and a mutual disdain for the town's new wine bar, which had the audacity to host poetry slams in a building that once housed the undertaker. On the morning in question, a pale, heavy Monday, the sea fog clung tighter than usual. A gull's cry cut through the stillness like a knife drawn slowly across porcelain, and by noon, the stillness was gone. Agnes Cutter, age 73, was found dead in her parlor. The room was immaculate, the teacup unbroken beside her, and the clock on the mantel stopped at 10:14 a.m. The only sign that anything had gone amiss was the envelope laid across her chest, sealed with a wax stamp no one in town recognized. Sheriff Michael Lorne, a lean man with a distrust of anything not found in a policy manual, ruled it a heart failure. No signs of forced entry, he said. No trauma. Peaceful, really. Elias Finch, however, stood by the parlor window and frowned. She wasn't expecting company, he said aloud, more to himself than to the sheriff. And yet someone came anyway. Clara, who had arrived with the sort of efficiency only grief and curiosity can fuel, bent to study the wax seal. Her fingers, gloved and steady, traced the design. It was unfamiliar but unsettling. "That," she whispered, "is not from around here." Elias turned from the window, his gaze settling on Clara's gloved fingers lingering over the envelope. The flickering light from the hearth cast soft shadows across her sharp features. Features etched with the kind of precision only years spent sifting through old truths could carve. "You think it means something?" he asked quietly, not wanting to startle her, but unable to keep the tremor of urgency from his voice. Clara looked up, her eyes meeting his with that same steady, calculating stare that had always unnerved him. "It's a message, or a warning, maybe both." She paused, then added with a faint ironic smile, "Though in this town, that's often the same thing." Elias nodded, stepping closer to the envelope. "I'm not sure the sheriff's heart failure theory will hold for long." His voice softened. Agnes Cutter wasn't just an old woman with a penchant for knitting. She was a keeper of stories. Some better left untold. Clara's eyes flickered with something unreadable. Regret, perhaps, or something sharper. "Which is exactly why I've been hesitant to dig too deep," she admitted. "There's a cost to unearthing things buried under decades of silence." He watched her carefully, noting the rare vulnerability slipping past her usual ironclad composure. "We're both outsiders in this, aren't we?" he said. "Not by birth, but by choice. You, with your archives and typewriter, and me, an academic running from the city. And yet, we're the ones who see the cracks." Clara smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of the lips. "Then I suppose it falls to us to see how wide those cracks run, and whether the whole town falls in with them." A moment passed between them, filled with the sound of distant church bells tolling, and the soft scratch of the wind slipping beneath the window panes. "Tomorrow," Elias said finally, "I'll visit Agnes's house again. There's something here that doesn't fit. The way the clock stopped, the unbroken teacup, the seal. It's like a story told in riddles." Clara folded the letter carefully, slipping it into her coat pocket. "And I'll start in the archives, see what I can find about that serpent. There are whispers, old enough to be dismissed as superstition, but sometimes superstition is the shadow cast by truth." They stood together in silence a moment longer before the sheriff cleared his throat impatiently, reminding them of the world outside their contemplations. The fog rolls in. Later that evening, as twilight bled into night, Elias returned to the Victorian on Hawthorne Street. The house groaned with the settling of years, its walls steeped in the scent of aging paper and wood smoke. He seated himself by the window overlooking the harbor, cane resting across his lap. Outside, the fog had thickened, swallowing the last outlines of the town. The lighthouse, a distant sentinel, blinked once, then again, casting a steady beam into the mist. Elias reached for the envelope Clara had left with him, a fragile promise wrapped in wax and mystery. His fingers traced the strange symbol of the three-headed serpent. A shadow passed beneath the street lamp outside. He froze. The past, he thought, was not something one outruns. It waits, and sometimes it comes calling. The seal upon the parlor table, in which the past insists on its presence. The morning after Agnes Cutter's body was discovered, Grayers Ferry awoke with a tension so subtle it could have been mistaken for fog. The mist had settled thick again, casting a pall over Hawthorne Street and muffling the world into a sort of hush, one that only grew heavier as word of the sealed envelope spread. Clara Whitcomb stood alone in the modest reading room of the town archives, the wax seal between her gloved fingers. She had borrowed it, without permission, technically, from Sheriff Lorne's evidence envelope the night before. Borrowed was the word she would use, though the truth felt more like possession. The symbol on the seal, a three-headed serpent encircling a twisted tree, was grotesquely ornate, the kind of design that spoke less of artistry and more of warning. Clara had spent the night thumbing through old ledger books and minutes from long-defunct town councils. Nothing matched, but something felt familiar. She lifted her eyes to the window. Beyond it, the town square looked like a ghost of itself. She had lived her entire life in Grayers Ferry, yet that symbol made her feel like a stranger inside it. Her breath clouded the glass. The wax burned cold in her palm. Down the street, Elias Finch paced the uneven stones of the churchyard. His cane made no sound on the soft earth, only occasional clicks on granite. He had spent the morning reviewing his late aunt's belongings, looking for anything that might explain how a woman like Agnes Cutter, quiet, punctual, particular, could become the locus of mystery. The old woman had kept journals, yes, but nothing recent. Her final entry was 2 years old and concerned a dispute with the garden club over hydrangea placement. There were receipts, half-finished crossword puzzles, and dog-eared letters from cousins long dead. None of it felt extraordinary. Elias found himself circling the same monument in the graveyard again and again, a weather-worn obelisk etched with names time had rendered meaningless. It stood tall and mute, like a sentinel of the town's collective silence, unyielding, unshaken. The past here wasn't buried, he murmured. It was folded into the very walls, like the tide pulling secrets under the stones. He didn't hear Clara's steps until she was beside him, a paper-wrapped bundle under one arm, her coat hem damp from the grass. "You walk like a man who expects the dead to rise," she said. "They've already begun," Elias replied. "We just haven't recognized them yet." She didn't laugh, neither did he. The fog tightened its grip, curling around their ankles like a snake, and the graveyard felt suddenly more crowded than it should have. "I've never seen a seal like this," she finally said, showing him the wax again. "Not in any record, not even in the founding charter, but the design, it isn't random, it's deliberate." Elias studied it closely. 3 heads, 1 body. Yes, a serpent, but not mythological. It's heraldic or cultic, maybe. He glanced at her. "Do you think Agnes Cutter was part of something?" Clara shook her head. "No, but I think she was keeping someone else's secret. Maybe for too long." A gull screamed above them, its cry swallowed by the fog. "I checked her post," Clara added. "She hadn't sent or received any letters in the last 3 months. Nothing official, but someone delivered this. And Agnes let them in. Or didn't have time to stop them." There was a pause, sharp, clean, and filled with shared understanding. They would have to tread carefully. Whatever had come to Grayers Ferry had roots, and roots, Clara knew, had a way of tangling with the dead. Elias glanced once more at the obelisk behind them, then at the path ahead. "We'll start with the cemetery records," he said. "If we're looking for a symbol like that, it wasn't drawn yesterday." Clara nodded. "And I'll see who Agnes quarreled with before she stopped writing." They parted ways without ceremony, 2 shadows dissolving into the fog. Back in the archive, Clara spread the old town charters across her desk. In the margins of one, near a listing of original land grants, was a name she hadn't seen in years: the Order of the Severed Root. Her pen hovered above the parchment. For the first time in a long while, Clara Whitcomb felt cold that had nothing to do with the fog, and somewhere beneath Grayers Ferry, something began to stir. Whispers beneath the church bell. Secrets take shape like shadows. The bell at St. Winifred's tolled 7 times, slow, sonorous, and faintly sour with sea air. In Grayers Ferry, the bell was never just the time. It was a summons, a signal, a warning if you knew how to listen. Clara Whitcomb stood beneath the bell tower's shadow, her coat drawn tight and her brow creased, not from the cold, but from the palpable shift in the town's rhythm. Agnes Cutter's death, though officially labeled natural, had dislodged something. Conversations were tempered when doors were opened. Eyes lingered too long on strangers. Even the regulars at Maribel's bakery spoke in thinner tones, as if the fog might carry their words where they shouldn't go. Clara watched as 2 women, Beatrice Ames and Marnie Doyle, emerged from the post office and bent their heads together in a whisper. Beatrice glanced toward Clara, hesitated, then moved on. Marnie gave the barest of nods. That was how it began. Not with accusation, but with exclusion. She turned up Hawthorne Street, past the wrought iron gate of the old Finch house. A light flickered in the parlor window. Elias was home. She hesitated before knocking. Not because she was uncertain. Clara Whitcomb rarely allowed herself that luxury, but because something about the glimmer in that window felt almost too alive for the hour. The town was sinking into itself, folding like parchment left too long in the rain, and Elias Finch, with his tired cane and reluctant smile, seemed the only one not weathered by it. The door opened before she could raise her hand. "I saw you coming through the glass," Elias said, stepping aside to let her in. "Your scarf's too bold for this town to miss." "It was a gift," Clara replied, unwinding the deep maroon fabric from her neck. "From someone with no taste, apparently. That narrows it to half the population." She offered the barest smile before stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and cedar, warmth and decay in equal measure. Books lay stacked not in disorder, but in quiet anticipation. The fireplace crackled low, a soft sighing in the otherwise hushed room. "You've read the papers?" she asked, already knowing he had. Elias nodded. "A heart attack, they say. Painless. Predictable." Clara trailed off, walking to the parlor window where the fog pressed like breath against the panes. "And yet," Elias repeated, rising from the armchair with a slight wince, "you've come here because it doesn't feel that way." Clara turned toward him, the flicker in her gaze somewhere between a question and an accusation. "You said she wasn't expecting company. I've been thinking about that, about the seal." Elias walked to the desk and opened a shallow drawer. He withdrew a folded envelope, yellowed with age. "My aunt received this years ago. I found it among her papers. She never mentioned it." Clara took the envelope with careful hands. No letter remained inside, but on the flap was a brittle residue, darker than wax. The same strange curve, the ghost of a three-headed serpent. "This symbol," she whispered, "it's not in any of the town's insignias. It's not part of our history. At least, not any history that's been recorded. There's more than one kind of record," Elias said quietly. "You know that better than anyone." Clara studied the envelope a moment longer, then set it gently on the desk. "I believe Agnes Cutter was part of something. Something older than any of us. A society, maybe, a vow. And I believe she broke it." Elias raised a brow. "And the penalty?" "She died with a letter on her chest," Clara said, her voice clipped. Someone was reminding her, and us, that no secret stays buried forever. A silence passed between them. Outside, the fog thickened like curdled milk. The bell at St. Winifred's rang again. A single chime this time, unexpected. They both turned instinctively toward the sound. "What time is it?" Elias asked. Clara checked the clock above the hearth. Not on the hour. They waited. No second chime came. Shared doubt and unshared truths. "Walk with me," she said. They walked without hurry, boots ticking softly across the cobbled path behind the churchyard. Fog wove through the headstones like lace pulled loose. "I went through the probate files," Clara said, voice low. "Agnes left everything to the Historical Society. No heirs listed. Not even her niece, the one who used to visit summers from Boston." "She had a niece?" Elias asked, genuinely surprised. Clara nodded. "Haven't seen her since I was 17. But the omission isn't the issue. It's what's missing. Her journals. Agnes was obsessive about documentation. Kept dozens. Not a single one is in the inventory." Elias slowed beside the oldest headstone, its etching worn to a whisper. You think someone removed them? I think someone wanted them gone before the will was read, Clara replied, because they contained something someone didn't want found. The name etched into the stone had almost disappeared under moss and weathering, but it was still readable beneath the grime. Obadiah Crowthorne, 1964. Clara traced the letters with her fingertips, a habit from her archival work. She didn't speak the name aloud, but it nested itself in her mind like a splinter. "I've been thinking," Elias said softly. "Agnes wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of being found." Clara turned to him. "By whom?" He didn't answer, because he didn't know. But the question sat between them like another shadow in the fog. The whisper that changed everything. They turned toward the road back into town when a voice rang out behind them. Thin, ragged male. "You're meddling in things better left buried." Both stopped. Clara spun. Elias peered into the swirling mist. No one. No footfalls. No departing shadow. Only the groan of the wind through the bell tower above them, and the cold hush of a town holding its breath. No footsteps, no departing shadow. Only the groan of the wind through the bell tower above them, and the cold hush of a town holding its breath. Elias frowned, not in fear, but recognition. The voice didn't belong to a ghost. Clara, ever the archivist, pulled a pencil from her coat and scribbled on the back of a bakery receipt. 3-headed serpent. Missing journals. Obadiah Crowthorne. She slipped it into her pocket like a prayer. Later, Clara walked home alone, her boots crunching softly on the frost-tipped leaves. As she passed the church, she noticed something, barely visible in the mist. A figure, cloaked, unmoving, standing near the bell tower's base. She paused, heart quickening. But when she looked again, it was gone. The archivist's quiet revelation. Clara turns over. Stones long untouched. The archives of Grayers Ferry were not so much a repository of knowledge as they were a holding pen for memories. They lived in the dim, dusty undercroft of the town hall, beneath a ceiling sagging from a century of dampness, smelling faintly of cedar, mildew, and secrets. The deeper Clara Whitcomb descended the steps, the more the darkness of the basement closed in, unmoved by the faint light above, or the probate record of Agnes Cutter clutched tightly in her hand. "I know you're hiding something," she murmured, not to a person but to the shelves. She hung the lantern on a rusted wall hook. Light pooled weakly, revealing filing cabinets with warped drawers, boxes tied in twine, ledgers with spines like brittle bones. Clara moved among them with the precision of a surgeon and the reverence of a mourner. She wasn't looking for Agnes's journals directly. Those had either been taken or never made it to the archive. But if someone removed them, they'd have left a scar. Clara had long since learned to read absence like a page. And there it was, a gap in the accession logs, summer of 1937. Items registered and stored under Cutter, Agnes E., then nothing. The handwriting resumed 3 weeks later in a different ink, different pressure. A silence recorded in ink. Clara flipped through the page margins. A faint pencil notation caught her eye. "See? Crowthorne Papers, Box 7. Her breath caught. Crowthorne, again. She hauled the box from its shelf with effort and reverence. Inside, water-damaged envelopes, fraying letters, a tarnished pin with a serpent motif. 3 heads, unmistakable. Beneath it all, a sealed parchment envelope. No stamp, just a sigil pressed into now fractured wax. She did not open it, not yet. A quiet visit. That evening, she brought the letter to Elias. Before Clara reached the steps, Elias opened the door, sleeves rolled up, spectacles perched low on his nose, a half-finished glass of scotch in hand. She jumped back slightly, startled. "How did you know I was at the door?" she asked. Elias smiled faintly. "I saw you walking up the sidewalk." He took the envelope with careful hands and turned it over in the lamplight. "This mark again." His voice dropped. "Clara, where did you find this?" "In the archives, filed under Crowthorne, hidden under Agnes's name." Elias set it down gently. "I remember that name from childhood. My aunt told me once in a way that sounded like a fairy tale or a warning that Obadiah Crowthorne was a man who traded in memory and debt." Clara arched a brow. "Sounds charming. Sounds dangerous." She nodded toward the envelope. "I think this is what Agnes feared being found." Elias studied her face. "Do we open it?" Clara hesitated. "Not yet. Not until we know more." The trouble with Martha Ellery. The next morning, Clara paid a visit to Martha Ellery, the town's oldest living resident and former postmistress, now half-blind and sharper than any blade. Martha's cottage was a quilt of time, lace curtains from another era, a phonograph still functional, and teacups with hairline fractures so fine they looked drawn in ink. Agnes Cutter? Martha sniffed. A proud woman, too proud sometimes, kept to herself. Not surprised she died alone. Clara tried delicacy. "Do you remember anyone named Crowthorne?" Martha paused. Her eyes, cloudy with age, seemed to clear a fraction. "There was a man once, Obadiah, wore dark suits in summer, never sweated, smelled like oil and violets, came from Boston, or said he did." "Did he know Agnes?" "Oh, he knew everyone. In that way, where knowing didn't feel like kindness." "And the seal?" Clara showed her a tracing. Martha's voice dropped. "I haven't seen that in 60 years. He used to send letters. One time someone opened one by mistake." She leaned in. "They said it wasn't written in ink. It bled." The fog and firelight. That night, Clara sat in her garden, the serpent-sealed letter resting on her lap. Wind moved the rosemary. Lantern light flickered. Elias arrived unannounced, carrying a folded newspaper. He tossed it on the table between them. Front page, local librarian questions legality of historical will. "They're coming after you," he said, tone flat. Clara didn't flinch. "Good means I'm on the right path." The fog moved in again, denser this time. It curled over the fence posts like smoke. In the distance, St. Winifred's bell tolled once. "They're warning us," Elias said. "Let them," Clara replied. And the envelope stayed sealed, for now. Grayers Ferry had long kept its secrets folded in attic boxes and archivist drawers. But Clara Whitcomb had begun to turn over stones, and something beneath them had started to stir. Footsteps in the pinewood grove. Elias begins to see what others ignore. The pinewood grove stretched north of the town proper, where the land sloped downward toward the sea, hemmed in by a weather-beaten stone wall and old family plots long untended. It was not a place people walked unless they had a reason, and Elias Finch, for better or worse, had begun to collect reasons. He stepped off the narrow footpath and into the trees, cane tapping lightly against roots and fallen needles. A fog still hung in the branches, thinner here than in town but present, like breath waiting to be drawn. The wind made the pines sway just enough to creak, a sound that had unnerved him as a child and now somehow comforted him. Time had taught him to trust things that didn't pretend to be anything other than what they were. Agnes had once walked here. He also remembered the stories, half-finished recollections from his aunt, how she would take long morning walks into the grove and return smelling faintly of pine and something colder, like copper. Agnes walked to forget, his aunt had once said, but the trees always remembered. Today, Elias wanted to see what they had remembered. A rusted gate and a memory. He followed the bend of a half-forgotten trail, barely more than a deer run, until he came upon it, a rusted iron gate, chained shut but hanging ajar. Beyond it, a clearing choked with overgrowth. It wasn't on any town maps, not recent ones, but he had seen it marked faintly in a surveyor's sketch Clara had shown him days ago, labeled Crowthorn Ground. Elias stepped through. At the center stood a low stone plinth, obscured by moss and time. He brushed it off with his sleeve. There, a name. O. Crowthorn. No dates, no epitaph. Just the initial and the name, like it was trying not to be found at all. And beside the plinth, a footprint. Faint, but recent. Not his. He knelt, inspecting it, heel deep, toe splayed slightly inward. A woman's shoe, he guessed. Not Clara's, not Agnes's. Someone else had come, and not long ago. And something else. Beneath the pine needles, half buried, was a shard of glass. Smooth-edged, once part of a bottle, green and thick. He pocketed it. Suspicion in sight. That afternoon, Elias mentioned the grove, casually, he thought, to Sheriff Lorne while in line at the post office. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but his voice cooled a degree. You walked out there alone? Briefly, Elias said. Just a curiosity. Nothing out there but old trees and half-truths. That's often where the real stories live. Sheriff Lorne said nothing more, but the conversation ended early, and when Elias turned to leave, he felt the eyes of others on his back. Watchful, wary. He walked slower on his way home, weighed down not by fear, but by awareness. Clara had said it before. The town doesn't like being watched. But Elias wasn't watching. He was listening. A quiet return. That night, Elias sat alone in his parlor, a leather-bound notebook open beside a nearly full glass of scotch gone warm. On the page, a rough sketch of the pinewood grove took shape. Trees carefully plotted, the winding path traced in deliberate strokes, the weathered plinth marked with a question, and just off-center a single footprint. At the heart of the drawing, 2 words were circled in ink. Crowthorn Ground. He hadn't yet shown it to Clara. Not out of mistrust, but out of instinct, a desire to hold the grove in his mind untouched, unfiltered. Some truths, he felt, needed to settle in solitude before they were spoken aloud. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like breath held too long. The town was shifting. He could feel it in the stutter of conversations, in the unnatural stillness that followed laughter, and in the way the gulls now lifted from the harbor without calling out, fleeing something no one had yet named. He wrote one more sentence in the notebook before closing it. Agnes Cutter was not the only one who left something in the woods. Outside, the wind moved through the pines, and for a moment, it almost sounded like a name. Grayers Ferry dismissed its past with polite nods and poorly kept maps. But Elias Finch had stepped into the trees and found that memory is not so easily erased, and some footprints cannot be ignored. Letters written in vanishing ink. Messages become murmurs of danger. Clara Whitcomb had learned long ago how to read silence, the kind that seeped between family dinners, between the lines of small-town obituaries, and, most acutely, the kind left behind in archives where the paper yellowed faster than the truth. The letter appeared in the middle of a deed register. It wasn't catalogued, it had no envelope, just a single page, folded twice, and tucked between land transfer records from 1913. The handwriting was slanted, precise, and fading fast. She didn't dare handle it without gloves. She brought it upstairs to her reading lamp, angled the light just so, and held her breath. What we promised is no longer safe. The seal should have stayed broken. They're waking. She's beginning to remember. There was no signature, but there was a faint watermark, one she only saw when she turned the page over, against the window's pale light, the outline of a serpent, 3 heads, twisting, watching. She called Elias. Unwelcome visitors and familiar names. He arrived at the archive half an hour later, face drawn, hair wind-blown. "I've just had the strangest visit," he said. "A man, claiming to be from the Historical Preservation Committee, wanted to know if I'd come across any private correspondences in my aunt's effects. Very polite, very deliberate. Did you ask for his name?" "Jameson Bell." Elias's mouth twisted, which is funny considering no one by that name exists in the committee registry. I checked. Clara handed him the letter. He read it twice, once in silence, the second time aloud. They're waking. She's beginning to remember. He looked at her. "Who's she?" Clara exhaled slowly. "Agnes. Has to be. What would she need to remember?" Clara didn't answer. Not yet. But she pulled a second folder from the side drawer. The deed transfer. Signed by Obadiah Crowthorne. And co-signed by someone else. A. Cutter. A garden dug too deep. That night, Clara went out into her garden. Not to prune, not to weed. She brought a spade and a flashlight. She remembered something odd Agnes had once told her at a garden club meeting over a decade ago. Always plant rosemary by the fence. It hides the smell of what you want forgotten. At the time, it had sounded like a quaint old superstition. Now it sounded like a breadcrumb. She dug beneath the rosemary hedge that lined her east wall, soil packed firm, rich, cold. 6 inches down, the spade hit something hard. It wasn't a box. It was a picture frame. Warped by time, corners softened by rot, the glass cold and splintered like old ice. Clara lifted it from the soil with both hands, heart pounding. The photograph inside was almost eaten away, its surface clouded with a dark, chemical bloom, silver decay, the kind that leaches memory from emulsion and leaves ghosts in its place. A group of figures stood stiffly before a crumbling stone archway, their black clothing sinking them into the shadows behind. 8, maybe 9. Agnes was among them. Young, straight-backed, unsmiling. Above their heads, carved into the stone, Ordo Veritatis, the Order of Truth, and there, etched into the arch's base, partially obscured by ivy and thyme, was the serpent again. 3 heads, 1 body, winding through the past, watching still. The letter. Elias sat in the dim hush of his study, the amber lamp casting long shadows across stacks of forgotten letters and dust-laced books. The air smelled faintly of brittle paper and old linen. His aunt's scent, lingering like a whisper too stubborn to leave. He combed through the final scraps of her correspondence, suspecting all along that he was chasing ghosts. Most of the letters were performative pleasantries. Thank you notes, condolences, polite updates, written in the controlled, distant script of a woman who had long since learned how to speak without revealing. He was about to call at a night when his eye caught the familiar spine of a book his mother had often mentioned, Hawthorne's Twice-Told Tales. Something about the title made him pause. He slid it from the shelf, and as he did, the back gave way with a faint click, a hidden compartment. Inside, pressed tightly between faded facsimiles, lay an envelope the color of old bone, unmarked, unassuming, and far too deliberate to have been forgotten. No address, no seal, no name. He opened it slowly. It was blank. Not even the faintest indentation of writing, until he moved toward the hearth. As the paper warmed, letters bled to the surface like ink rising through skin. 5 words, uneven, shaky, watching. You are not the first. Elias stared at the page, the quiet folding around him like fabric drawn too tight. His hands didn't move, but his expression shifted, just slightly, as though something ancient had stirred behind his eyes. Not surprise, not even fear. This hadn't begun with Agnes Cutter. She was only the latest echo. There had been others. The 3-headed serpent's mark. Old symbols resurface with new threats. The fog had grown greedy. It curled beneath doors, licked the window panes, and settled low in the streets of Grayers Ferry like it meant to stay. Clara Whitcomb watched it from her study. A pen paused over the margin of a weathered field journal. The serpent had resurfaced. 3 heads, 1 body, ancient, deliberate. She'd come across the symbol again, this time not in old society records or carved into forgotten stone, but freshly etched into the underside of a library desk. A sharp carving, deep and recent, hidden beneath decades of initials and chewing gum. The blade that made it had been handled with purpose. She had said nothing to Elias yet. Not because she didn't trust him, but because her instincts told her this one felt personal. Elias, meanwhile, paced his study with the deliberate restraint of a man trying not to appear disturbed. The cryptic letter, "You are not the first," was tucked into a new file. One he'd sealed and labeled by hand. Unsorted findings. He knew it was absurd. It would not remain unsorted for long. The thought of it sitting idle made his skin crawl. There was a knock at the door, not the front, the side. He froze. Only Clara and the postman used the side entrance. When he opened it, no one was there, just a single object lying precisely at the center of the top step. A matchbox from the Trident, a now shuttered tavern at the edge of town, abandoned since 1959 after a fire of suspicious origin. Inside the box, a scrap of newsprint, the obituary of Agnes Cutter, clipped, folded, unmarked, except for a single symbol drawn on the margin in red ink. The Serpent. They met late that evening at Clara's kitchen table, silently reaching the same conclusion. She slid the library sketch toward him. He placed the matchbox beside it, both reaching for the scotch. "I thought this began with a death," Clara said softly. "It began with a promise," Elias murmured, "and something broken." They didn't speak again for several minutes. Outside, the church bell gave one long toll, though it wasn't the hour. The following morning, Clara awoke to find the flower beds in her front garden disturbed. Soil overturned. Roses snapped at the base. At first, she thought it might have been deer or the town stray, but then she saw it, drawn into the mulch by a finger-gloved hand. 3 interlocked circles, each with a dot at its center, a serpent's simplified form. Crude, but unmistakable. It was no longer just history resurfacing. Someone wanted them to know they were not alone in looking. And perhaps they never had been. The garden's silent witness, the past blooms and withers. Clara stood in her garden just after dawn, arms folded, robe cinched tight, boots damp with dew. The world was colorless in the early light, muted grays and dull browns where her roses should have been. Something had been here. Not a raccoon, not the wind. Each flower had been clipped at the base. Clean, intentional cuts that made her stomach tighten. But it wasn't the ruined blooms that chilled her. It was what had been drawn in the soil with a finger or stick. 3 interlocking circles with dots in their centers. The mark. Again. Crude, yes, but unmistakable. She didn't call Elias right away. Instead, she went inside and pulled the shade. Somewhere, someone wanted her to know they were watching. The return of Jonah Crowthorne. The bell above Maribel's bakery gave its usual tinkle as Elias entered for coffee and a lie about how well he'd slept. Maribel, polishing glass behind the counter, froze mid-swipe. "You've heard, then?" she said. "Heard what?" She lowered her voice, not for drama, but because that's how dangerous things were spoken of in Grayers Ferry. "Jonah Crowthorne's back in town." Elias blinked. "I didn't think he was the returning sort." Neither did his mother. She leaned in slightly. "Word is he came back the day before Agnes died." Elias left his coffee behind. Jonah. He found Jonah Crowthorne seated alone on the broken bench outside the boarded-up VFW hall, a cigarette burning between fingers stained with engine grease. He wore a coat too heavy for the season and a scowl that looked permanent. "Mr. Finch," Jonah said before Elias spoke, "didn't think you'd be the first to say hello." "I didn't come to say hello." Jonah chuckled. "Number I suppose not." They sat in silence. Elias studied him. A man who looked built for war, even if he'd never served. Crowthorne blood ran thick in Grayers Ferry, old, complicated. "Why did you come back now?" Elias asked. Jonah flicked ash into the weeds. "Agnes and I understood each other. That's a curious way to phrase it. She was part of something," Jonah said. "So was my grandfather Thaddeus. So was half this damned town, once upon a time." He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph, folded so many times the corners had gone soft. Agnes Cutter, younger, standing beside a man with Jonah's jawline and eyes full of winter. Behind them, the carved stone arch with the inscription Ordo Veritatis, and on the corner of the image, inked faintly in red, the Serpent. That evening, Elias and Clara reconvene, Clara slid the ruined rose stem across Elias's desk like it was evidence in a courtroom. "They wanted me to see it," she said. "They left the mark in my garden." Elias handed her the photo. "Jonah Crowthorne says Agnes was part of something. And his grandfather, too." Clara's eyes scanned the image. "The order?" He didn't say it aloud, but he didn't need to. She sat, hard. "So we're not just tracing a murder. We're peeling back whatever this town spent decades building on top of it." Elias nodded. "And every layer we touch makes someone nervous." Outside, the fog rolled in thick and low, curling along the porch railings like smoke from a fire not yet lit. And somewhere beneath it all, the past waited, breathing. Echoes from the abandoned wharf. The sea keeps its secrets. The sea had always spoken in Grayers Ferry, in whispers, in warnings, in the creak of hulls no longer seaworthy, and the clatter of gulls like bones in a wind chime. But the wharf hadn't truly breathed in decades, and yet it waited. Elias stood at the edge of it now, hands in the pockets of his coat, boots soaked from the tide-damp sand, the wind tugging faintly at his collar. Ahead, the warped boards stretched like the ribs of some great sleeping beast. The water beneath slapped with a low, tired rhythm. Fog clung to the pylons like old guilt. Jonah Crowthorne lit a cigarette with cupped hands, the flame flashing for only a second before the wind snuffed it out. "She used to come here," Jonah said. "Agnes, every Thursday, same time. Always left something at the base of the piling by the rusted bell." "What kind of something?" Elias asked. Jonah shrugged. Never knew that was the rule. Clara stepped forward, scarf tight around her neck, eyes narrowed. "Who made the rule?" Jonah smiled, small and humorless. "Same people who carved that symbol into the stone behind the old church. The ones who made this place what it is. The offering stone." Beneath the rusted bell, they unearthed it. Flat and black. A stone worn smooth by tides and crusted at the edges with barnacle and time. It lay half buried in the sand like a relic waiting for remembrance. Clara crouched low, her gloved hands brushing away the grit until the carved shape emerged, a triangle enclosing 3 interlocked circles. The symbol again, but this time it looked older, not faded, enduring, etched deeper, like it had once meant everything. Elias knelt beside her, sweeping aside a tangle of seaweed. His fingers paused at the edge of the stone. "There's something beneath it," he said quietly. With a soft grunt, he lifted the slab just enough. A metallic tap sounded beneath, sharp and deliberate. A key. No larger than a thumb, forged of dark iron, its bow twisted into the unmistakable shape of a coiled serpent, fangs bared, poised mid-strike. Clara turned it over in her palm, reverent, as if the salt-stained thing might evaporate in daylight. "What did Agnes bury that needed this much warning?" she asked aloud, though the wind was the only one to answer. Jonah, leaning against a piling, flicked ash from his cigarette and tilted his chin toward the hill overlooking the harbor. "Whatever it was," he said, his voice low, "it's waiting in the Cutter crypt." The crypt. The key fit easily. The door groaned like it hadn't been opened in decades, but no resistance stopped them. The crypt was cut into the hill behind the cemetery, facing the sea like a forgotten prayer. Inside, the air was briny and stale. Dust floated in narrow beams of light that filtered through the iron lattice overhead. Stone shelves lined the walls, each bearing an engraved name. Cutters mostly. Agnes's plaque had already been affixed, though her remains had not yet been placed. But it was the back wall that caught Clara's eye. A section of stone that looked newer, slightly off in color, out of rhythm with the rest of the crypt. Elias pressed a hand to it. Hollow. They pried it loose with a rusted crowbar from the gardener's shed, and behind it was a small cavity. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and bound with waxed twine, lay a leather-bound book. Clara opened it with reverence. The handwriting was Agnes's, elegant, stern. The first page held only a title, Testimonium. Beneath that, a single line in Latin, Veritas Scelera Parit. Truth begets crimes. Revelation. They sat in Clara's study hours later, the book spread across the table like a scripture. Agnes had documented names, events, meetings in candlelit parlors and rites held in the woods during the equinoxes. But the details were sparse, as though even on the page the truth flinched from being told too fully. There were references to the circle, to initiates, and more troubling to cleansings. Some kind of society, Elias murmured. Fraternal, possibly religious, or cultic, Clara added, and definitely secret. One entry, dated 1949, mentioned a failed vote. He tried to stop it. Agnes had written, said the line was drawn too far this time, but once it's set in motion, no hand can halt it. And then, we agreed never to speak of the boy again. Elias frowned. What boy? Clara turned the page. The next was missing, torn out. Later that night, Elias stood by the window of his study, the crypt key still cold in his palm. The tide was high. The fog had returned, thick and slow. Somewhere, beneath sea and soil, the past was still moving. And on the desk behind him, the pages of Testimonium whispered faintly in the draft, as though something within them wasn't done being read. When the fog swallows sound, sanctuary proves treacherous. By morning, the fog had thickened to the consistency of milk, coating Grayers Ferry in a muffled hush. Sounds grew strange in it, distant bells warped and softened, footsteps vanishing mid-step. Even the birds kept low, wings slicing through mist, as if trying not to disturb something older than flight. Clara and Elias said little over breakfast. The testimonium sat open on the table between them, its spidery ink crawling across the page like something half erased. Clara had made a list of the names mentioned. 4 had check marks beside them, all confirmed by town records. The 5th, M. Harlan, had no entry date. Only the word initiated and the phrase sacrament agreed to despite hesitation. Elias tapped the name. Michael Harlan, William's older brother, died in a fire back in '67. Clara frowned. A church fire. The fire, Elias corrected. The one that gutted St. Winifred's. Clara didn't speak for a long moment. William never talks about him, she said finally, or the fire. Elias stood and walked to the window. The fog hadn't lifted. If anything, it was pressing harder. Then, maybe it's time someone asked. The fracture. They found William Harlan at the Historical Society, where he spent most mornings, dusting artifacts that didn't belong to anyone. When Clara held up the journal, his expression didn't shift, but his eyes hardened. I assume you've read it, he said. Enough, Clara replied. Though I imagine you could help fill in the parts that were torn out. William turned away and began reordering the display case of 18th century maritime tokens. Why would I know anything about missing pages? Because your name is mentioned in the margins, and your brother's name is in it also. Silence pressed in, awkward and absolute, until William let out a nervous, rasping throat clear, as if trying to swallow something unspoken. William finally looked up. What exactly do you want? Elias stepped forward. The truth, about what Agnes was protecting, about why someone would want her journals destroyed, about what happened in that church. A flicker crossed William's face. Regret or calculation? He sighed. You're stirring up stories that should stay cold. That book, Testimonium, was never meant to be read, especially not by outsiders. I was born here, Clara said, her voice cutting. My family's buried under the same moss as yours. Don't call me an outsider. You've always stood outside the circle, William replied, and that was by design. The missing pages. Back at Clara's home, they reviewed the journal again. Elias paced while Clara traced the seams where pages had been excised, cleanly, with a blade. Someone didn't want a name exposed, she said, or a sin. That evening, Elias returned to his aunt's house alone. The fog had crept through the keyholes and lay across the floors like a shroud. He went to the parlor, turned on the lamp, and stared at the hollowed book that had first concealed the blank letter. Hawthorne's Twice-Told Tales, a fable buried within another. He turned the pages slowly. There, pressed inside the back cover, behind the final glued page, a strip of aged vellum thin as onion skin. The boy was not chosen. He saw too much, he remembered too well. Then, in a different hand, he was made to forget. Betrayal. The knock came at midnight. Elias opened the door to find Sheriff Michael Lorne on the stoop, his hat soaked, his expression unreadable. I need to ask you to come with me, he said. Elias blinked. What's happened? Michael hesitated. Clara's study. There's been a break-in. They arrived to find drawers emptied, glass shattered, and pages of the testimonium torn and strewn like confetti. Clara stood with her back to them, motionless. They took the journal, she said without turning, but not before they marked me. She turned slowly. Her left palm bore the serpent symbol, drawn in blood. Michael stepped back. What in the... Elias stepped forward. Clara's voice was low. It was someone I knew. I couldn't see his face, but he knew the house, the routine. He said, "You never should have read it." Michael glanced at Elias. "Do you believe me?" Clara asked, voice brittle. The sheriff didn't answer. He looked at Elias. "I'm going to have to hold the both of you, for your safety, and until I sort this out." "What are you really trying to protect, Sheriff?" Elias asked. Michael's jaw tightened. "The town." And then, almost inaudibly, "And my father." The lock and the liar. Protection becomes a cage, and a clue is set free. The holding cell at Grayers Ferry Municipal was cleaner than it had any right to be. A single bulb buzzed overhead, casting a jaundiced glow across the iron bars and the faded linoleum floor. Elias Finch sat on the bench, coat folded neatly beside him, staring at the water stain on the ceiling like it might rearrange itself into an answer. Across from him, Clara paced. 3 precise steps, turn. 3 more, turn again. Neither had spoken in 20 minutes. Finally, Elias broke the silence. "Well," he said, "if they meant to protect us, they might have tried a little less lock and key." Clara didn't stop pacing. "This isn't protection. This is containment. Sheriff Lorne knows we're getting too close to something. He thinks we'll stir the town into panic." Clara's laugh was bitter. "The town lives in panic. It just calls it tradition." Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy, deliberate. Sheriff Michael Lorne appeared, keys jangling at his belt like a warning. "You're being released," he said. No apology, no explanation. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Decided we're not dangerous after all?" Lorne didn't meet his gaze. "Let's just say someone vouched for you." Clara stopped pacing. "Who?" But Lorne was already turning away. "Ask Jonah Crowthorne." Out of the cage, into the fog. The air outside was sharp with salt and smoke. A storm was moving in from the coast, and with it came the sense that the ground beneath Grayers Ferry was shifting. Jonah was waiting by the war memorial statue, smoking, eyes hidden behind a pair of rain-specked glasses. "You're welcome," he said, before either could speak. Clara crossed her arms. "Why did you tell him to let us out?" "I didn't. I told him he'd have to answer for what happens if you disappear." He handed Clara a folded scrap of paper. This was in Agnes's belongings. It wasn't there yesterday. On it, a symbol they now knew too well, triangle, 3 circles, but drawn incorrectly. 1 circle was open, not closed. Clara frowned. A mistake? Elias shook his head. No, a message. An incomplete circle means someone left, or was left out. Jonah lit another cigarette. Maybe not everyone in the order agreed with what they were doing. Clara looked between them. A defector. Elias nodded. Or a witness. The forgotten chapel. Rather than return to the crypt, Clara insisted they take the coastal trail toward the ruined foundation of St. Winifred's original chapel, burned down in 1897, never rebuilt. The stone footings remained, moss-covered and crooked, half swallowed by blackberry bramble. Salt air whispered through broken walls. The fire had taken most of it, and the decades had claimed the rest. But as Elias pushed aside a collapsed section of stone, his boot struck something hollow. An unexpected thud beneath the ivy-choked ground. A trapdoor. Its iron ring was rusted but intact, wood swollen and fused with the earth. It took all 3 of them, grunting and breathless, to wrench it free. What lay beneath was a spiral of stone steps, parched and vanishing into shadow. Elias led the descent, their steps muffled by age and dust. At the bottom, not a crypt, a chamber. The stone walls bore soot, but the fire hadn't touched everything. In one alcove, shards of pottery and scorched parchment lay sealed in an old stone niche, protected by a thick slab. A rotted tapestry clung stubbornly to one wall, its threads faded, but its pattern unmistakable, the serpent's coil frayed but unbroken. Then Clara found it, carved directly into the stone, faint beneath lichen and age. One must leave to remember. One must remember to return. She ran her fingertips over the words, breath catching. And there, embedded in the wall behind a slab that had long since cracked and shifted, was something stranger still. a tile mosaic partially destroyed, but visible in pieces. Figures, robed, a circle of them, and in the center a woman in black, straight-backed and unbowed. Clara drew in a breath. "That's Agnes." Elias stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "And that," he added, pointing to a smaller, nearly erased figure at her side, "looks like Jonah's grandfather." He turned slowly, taking in the dark, forgotten space. This wasn't a chapel. Clara nodded. It was a sanctuary. But neither of them said what they were both thinking. It may also have been a prison. Above them, thunder cracked like a gavel. The storm had arrived. And somewhere, someone still alive remembered the day the order fractured. Because the open circle wasn't a warning, it was an invitation. The scholar's unspoken doubt. Trust begins to falter. The fog rolled inland earlier than usual, thin as gauze but heavy with unsaid things. Elias Finch sat at the edge of his study, his fingers idle on the rim of a cold teacup. On the desk before him lay a photo, sepia, water-stained, curled at the edges. 5 figures stood outside a university hall, all in overcoats, their faces young and composed. One of them was his aunt. Another was a man Elias hadn't seen in over 30 years. And the third, he now realized, with a slow, disbelieving chill, bore the unmistakable jawline of Jonah Crowthorne. Only, this photo was dated 1968. He leaned in. Not Jonah, too old, but the resemblance was uncanny. Elias murmured, the name scrawled in neat pen on the back. Professor Thaddeus Crowthorne, Jonah's grandfather. And standing beside him was Elias's mentor. A man who once warned him, "The difference between truth and knowledge is how long you're willing to keep digging." Elias had stopped digging once, maybe too soon. Across town, Clara Whitcomb stood in the reading room of the Grayers Ferry Historical Society, sifting through the contents of a battered archive box marked Private Cutter Estate. She insisted on seeing it the moment they were released from the sheriff's station. The society's custodian, a pale, thin man jittering from too much coffee and unsettled by office rumors, had reluctantly given in. Inside the box, brittle ledger pages, cryptic handwritten notes, and a torn fragment from what appeared to be a long-lost diary. July 6th, I saw Jonah again. The resemblance to his grandfather is subtle but unmistakable. The tilt of his chin, and the quiet calculation behind his eyes. It's not his face that unnerves me, but the ambition threaded through his words. I don't trust what he's after. Either he's hiding something, or worse, he isn't, and I still can't see the angle. Clara stood still. Jonah had claimed not to know Agnes well, yet here she was, writing about him, years ago, before the letter, before the seal, before the night she died. They met that evening on Elias's porch. Jonah arrived first, a cigarette burning low between his fingers, his gaze lost somewhere in the drifting fog. I went through the Cutter journals again, he said quietly. There's a cipher I missed the first time. I think there's a message hidden beneath the family tree entries. Elias didn't respond. I'll need your help, Professor. Latin's never been my strength. The word, professor, hung in the air. It wasn't sarcastic, nor was it necessary. But it carried a strange weight. Something about the way Jonah said it felt too familiar, too knowing. Elias felt it settle into him, though he couldn't quite name the feeling. Before he could answer, Clara appeared at the gate. Her expression was hard to read, focused, maybe, or deliberately neutral. "I found a page from Agnes's journal," she said without preamble. "You're mentioned, Jonah. She didn't trust you." Jonah didn't flinch. She didn't trust anyone. Clara held out the page. "You said you barely knew her." "I didn't, not really. She called me in, out of the blue, last year. Told me something was stirring again. The people were remembering things they shouldn't." Elias leaned forward. "What things?" Jonah hesitated. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes, not calculation, but reluctance, as if he had wandered too deep into a story and couldn't find the edge anymore. She said the order never died, just went dormant, and someone was waking it up again. She thought she made a mistake. There it was, that tone that echoed. The same way Elias's mentor spoke, late in a lamplit study, after too much sherry and just before the silence stretched too long. A tone that meant, "I've seen more than I'll admit to." Later, after Jonah left, Clara stayed behind. Elias went to the sideboard and poured 2 glasses of scotch. He handed one to her without a word, then settled into the armchair across from her. For a while, they drank in silence. "He's hiding something," Clara said at last. "Not everything, but enough." Elias didn't answer, not with words, not even a nod. He turned his attention back to the photograph on the table. His thumb brushed over the curve of his aunt's shoulder, then traced the faint outline of the crowthorn man beside her. "I think," Elias said slowly, "this began long before we got involved. And Jonah might not be lying." Clara studied him. "Then what is he doing?" "What if?" he said under his breath. "He's trying to complete what they began. Crossing into the deepening dark. Darkness becomes more than absence." The dream came to Elias again. A corridor of stone, walls weeping salt. His cane echoed louder than it should. A woman's voice whispered ahead of him, not calling, but warning. "You are not the first." He woke before reaching her. He always did. The next morning, fog draped the town like mourning cloth. Elias arrived at the library to find Clara already there, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back with surgical precision. A single sheet of parchment lay in front of her, weighed down with paperweights shaped like owls. "The cipher Jonah mentioned," she said, not looking up. "It's real. I broke it." Elias stepped closer. A family tree. Agnes's, yes, but overwritten. Names circled, crossed out, connected by inked lines like veins. Notes in Latin, barely legible. Stirps non fracta, errata. Bloodline not broken, misguided. The serpents always coil inward. "I don't think Agnes was afraid of being killed," Clara murmured. "I think she was afraid of being used." Elias tapped one name at the bottom of the tree. "Who's this?" "Thora Gaskell." Elias frowned. "That's the name of the florist. 87, nearly blind, and last seen arguing with Agnes 2 days before she died." Clara looked at him. She was also one of the last living members of the town's genealogical society. And get this, she used to tutor Jonah in Latin. They decided to split up. Clara is to speak with Thora. Elias is to follow a different lead. Elias walked the wooded edge of the Crowthorne property. The path was overgrown but familiar. His aunt had walked it often, always alone. She told him once that the woods whispered more kindly than people. The boundary stone, flat, slick with moss, and etched with the faint outline of a three-headed serpent. He found footprints. Not boot prints, not Clara's. Something heavier and recent. He followed them. The footprints didn't lead to a trail as he'd expected, but toward a house, weathered but not abandoned. The paint had faded, the porch sagged slightly at one corner, but the windows were intact, the path recently cleared of debris. Someone had been tending it. Quietly, deliberately. Elias hesitated at the threshold before pushing the door open. It wasn't locked. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and something else. Ink, perhaps. Paper. He moved through the front room, furnished, but spare, until he found a narrow door behind a bookcase. It opened with a reluctant groan. Beyond it, a small windowless study. The walls were lined with filing cabinets and shelves stacked high with yellowing letters, notebooks, and ledgers. A desk stood in the center, littered with maps, marked up pages, and the curling edges of correspondence stamped with the same serpent sigil he'd seen before. It was a room built to keep secrets. Elias stepped forward, fingers brushing across names he recognized. Clara's family and his own. At the back of the room, a single light bulb swung faintly overhead. Someone had been here. And recently. Back in town, Clara knocked on Thora Gaskell's door. It opened an inch. "I know who you are," the old woman rasped. "You'll ruin everything." "I just want to know what Agnes was protecting," Clara asked. Thora's eyes glinted, milky but sharp. "She wasn't protecting, she was preventing. There's a difference." The door slammed shut. Suspects are gathering that night. Elias and Clara met once more in his parlor, firelight flickering across their faces. They spread their findings across the table. Names, symbols, and notes. Too many connections, too many gaps. "I don't know who to trust anymore," Clara said, rubbing her temples. "I do," Elias said softly. "Trust what doesn't fit." Clara glanced up. "Meaning?" "Everyone's been too careful," he said. "Except Jonah. He stumbles, misspeaks, lies badly. But maybe the worst liar's the one who never gets caught." The suspects. Jonah Crowthorne, shadowed past, knows too much, lies badly. Motive unclear. Protector or predator? Reverend Christopher Lorne, calm as still water, and just as hard to read. He was always nearby, rarely speaking, but listening, always listening. Some said he was a guardian of the town's oldest secrets. Others wondered if he was keeping them for himself. Thora Gaskell, elderly but razor-minded, a horticulturist with an encyclopedic knowledge of heirloom flora and family trees alike. She tended both with equal precision and may have cultivated more than roses to preserve a bloodline for reasons only she truly understood. And then there's Edwina Mallory, the local postmistress. Rarely mentioned, always present. Owns every key in town. Once claimed to be Agnes's eyes and ears. She also collects wax seals for fun. "Outlandish," Clara muttered when Elias suggested Edwina. Elias only shrugged. In Grayers Ferry, the outlandish is just what no one's admitted yet. Outside Elias's parlor window, the fog had thickened to the point of blindness. Street lamps flickered, their glow swallowed before it could touch the glass. Somewhere in the distance, The bell at St. Winifred's rang a single hollow chime, though no hour was due. Clara stood at the fireplace, turning the page of the journal Elias had found. Her hand paused over a half-torn entry, one line inked hastily, as though Agnes had changed her mind mid-sentence. The ritual requires a witness. She said nothing at first, then, if this is real, Elias, if the order wasn't just a myth, then someone had to stand watch. Not just once, over generations. Elias didn't answer. He was staring at the fire, expression unreadable. His tea had gone cold. The notebook with the initials CDL lay between them like a wound waiting to be named. Clara turned back to the window. Beneath the gaslight, a figure stood in the road. Not moving. Watching the house. She reached for the curtain, slowly, instinctively, but before she could pull it shut, the figure turned and vanished into the mist. Elias stood, suddenly uneasy. "Did you recognize them?" he asked. Clara nodded. But it wasn't an answer of certainty. It was something worse. She recognized too many people. And that meant someone was wearing a familiar face. The hour the clock stopped. The dead refuses to stay silent. The figure beneath the gaslight was gone, but the silence they left behind had weight. Clara stayed at the window long after the mist swallowed them whole. Elias moved to her side, his voice low, uncertain. "Someone is watching us, again." Clara's hand, still clutching the curtain, trembled slightly. It wasn't curiosity, that was a warning. Elias turned off the lamp. "Then we ought to listen." The fire snapped once in the grate, then went quiet again. They stood in the half-light of the dying coals, the ledger open on the table, the Serpent seal glinting faintly in the ash-covered wax. There was no doubt now. Agnes Cutter had feared more than old age, and the town, which once whispered its secrets, had begun to press them into flesh and stone. Clara stepped back, collected herself. "We need to go to the crypt," she said. The Cutter crypt sat behind the cemetery wall, tucked into the roots of a crooked pine that had long since overgrown its boundaries. The air smelled of wet iron and pine needles. Fog had begun to pool low over the graves like water rising in a basin. They came cloaked, hoods drawn, walking separately at first, then together once the road disappeared. Elias held the iron key between his fingers as though it might burn him. It did not, but it was warm. The lock clicked open with a sound like a breath drawn after decades beneath the earth. Inside, the crypt was colder than the night. Dry. Preserved by intention. Stone steps led downward into a narrow vault lined with empty niches. At its far wall, barely visible in the light of Elias's lantern, there was a carving that made Clara stop short. What is buried binds, what is remembered frees. She reached out and traced the words. It's older than the chapel, older than Agnes. This wasn't built for mourning. It was built for preservation. Elias stepped ahead, his cane echoing in the still air. Behind a shelf of dislodged stone tablets, he found a recessed panel, almost invisible but not untouched. The dust there had been disturbed. There was a switch. Clara didn't hesitate. She pressed it. The wall opened, not with drama, but with the slow resignation of something that had waited too long to matter. Behind it, a passage carved into bedrock, narrow and sloping down farther than any local record, claimed the cemetery was deep. The air changed, drier, older, They descended. It was not a crypt, it was a chamber, and at its center, perfectly preserved, sat a table bearing two items, a lacquered black chest and an envelope. No dust, no cobwebs, as though someone had placed them there recently, or had been tending to them. Clara approached the envelope first. Her name, written in the same precise hand Agnes used to sign public library donations. For Clara Whitcomb, if she comes looking. There are truths I will not let rot beside my bones. I was made a witness. I did not consent, but I remained. There are names you must find, patterns you must break. If you are reading this, then they have begun again. You and Elias are not chosen. You are marked. Be careful with trust, especially his. Clara read the last line 3 times. Especially his, she repeated aloud. Elias leaned over her shoulder. You think she meant... Clara shook her head. No, she wouldn't have known Jonah, not well enough. She opened the black chest. Inside was a ledger, bound in leather, pages marked with entries in Agnes's Lupin script. Transactions, donations. The same names again and again, some familiar, others ancient. A final entry. CDL, final disbursement. For silence, Clara drew in a breath. Reverend Lorne. Elias's voice dropped. What's he silencing? Before she could answer, something thudded behind them. They turned. Nothing. Just the air tightening. Just the chamber remembering what had been buried. They emerged from the crypt near dawn, the fog yellowing with morning light. The gate clicked shut behind them with finality. Neither spoke until they reached the edge of the cemetery, where the town came back into view, unchanged on the surface but no longer still. Are you going to him? Elias asked. Clara nodded. He's known too much for too long. Then don't go alone. She looked at him, uncertain now of who exactly she stood beside. I won't, she said, not truly. The nave of St. Winifred's was cold and shadowed when Clara stepped inside. Reverend Christopher David Lorne stood at the altar, lighting the last of the morning candles, unaware of her approach until the echo of her boots touched stone. He turned, saw her, did not smile. I wondered when you'd come, he said. Clara stepped forward and placed the envelope on the pew between them. Her voice was quiet, steady. She named you, she wrote it down. Lorne looked at the envelope, then at her. Then I suppose, he said, we'll have to discuss what she didn't write down. And behind him, somewhere deeper in the church, the old clock began to tick again, for the first time in 20 years. The names beneath the ledger, motives begin to surface. The rain had settled in with the intent of staying. A steady tapping on the windows, a misty glaze over the town. The scent of brine and wet cedar filled Elias Finch's study as he leaned closer to the fire, shoulders hunched, a blanket draped across his knees. Around him, papers bloomed in haphazard stacks. Agnes's journals, estate records, cryptic notes, and newspaper clippings yellowed and brittle. The room smelled of damp pages and slow-brewing unease. He had stopped sleeping entirely, except for the few hours when exhaustion overtook him like a hand across the mouth. Tonight, he was chasing names. On his desk sat 2 documents. One was familiar, the slim, hand-bound ledger from the Cutter crypt, its entries penned in a woman's unadorned script. Agnes's. The second was older, discovered 2 days ago by Clara in the archive's off-limits shelf, hidden behind a wall panel marked Property of St. Winifred's Rectory. No one had touched it in nearly 50 years. Its cover was cracked, its spine fragile, its contents unsettling. The ledgers overlapped in strange ways, identical notations, numbers, and most hauntingly, identical initials repeated across decades. Elias turned to a page marked 1974. BAJCOCAL. They appeared beside figures and phrases that carried an echo of ritual, tithe rendered, silence held, memory restricted. But what turned Elias's stomach was a final line, penned with more pressure than any other, the ink having bled through the page. Renewal failed. Across town. Then he flipped to a page at the very front of the ledger. The first name, dated 1935, Obadiah Crowthorne, keeper of the Order of Truth. The Order, not a name whispered anymore, but its dust still clung to the windowsills of Grayers Ferry. Elias picked up the photo Clara had found in her garden and held it next to the ledger. Agnes, young and unsmiling. Jonah's grandfather, his face nearly unlined. And between them, a third figure erased with such violence that the paper was torn straight through. Elias swallowed hard. He knew what this was. A ledger of secrets. A financial and spiritual account of an organization operated under the illusion of piety. And if this ledger was to be believed, Agnes Cutter had not just known about it, she had recorded its sins. That night, they met again in Elias's parlor, both worn thin and wired with adrenaline. The fireplace crackled as if trying to hush their voices. On the table between them, the ledgers, the photograph, and the rose stems still faintly marked with decay. "I think I know what the initials mean," Clara said. Elias leaned in. "Go on." B.A., Beatrice Ames. J.C., Jonah Crowthorne. O.C., Obadiah Crowthorne. And A.L., Alden Lorne, the sheriff's father. She nodded slowly. "That's a name passed down anyway, said to have died young, in an accident near the cliffs. But there's no obituary, no burial plot, no trace in the public record. Just silence, like he was there, and then wasn't." Elias frowned. Deliberate silence. Clara met his gaze. "Feels more like someone erased him." The fire snapped louder, as if protesting. Elias didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached for the photograph again. Agnes, Beatrice, Obadiah, and the man who stood just out of focus, taller than the others, set apart. He tapped the figure with the tip of his finger. Maybe he never left. Maybe he just stepped into the dark. Clara opened the final pages of Agnes's journal and pointed to a line written in pencil. "The garden holds the last name. When it flowers, I'll be gone." "She meant me to find it," Clara said. "My garden is the last key." Elias looked at her. "And what are you going to do with it?" Clara poured herself a glass of scotch. "Dig, and not just in the dirt." Elsewhere, in the shadows of the coastal bluff, a lone figure watched the lights flicker in Elias's study window. The fog drifted in soft ribbons around the trees, brushing shoulders like old friends. The figure lit a cigarette, inhaled deeply, and tapped ash into the ivy. He had seen the ledger passed across the table, and the realization tightened Elias Finch's jaw. What had once been hidden was now being read aloud, its truths scratched in ink and silence both. Its cracked red spine bore a single Latin phrase in faded gold: "Qui tacet consentire videtur." He who is silent is taken to agree. Grayers Ferry no longer kept secrets. It counted them, and the tally had begun. The archivist's line in the dirt. Clara confronts Beatrice, and the truth grows teeth. The fog did not lift that morning, as if the town sensed an impending change. Clara Whitcomb moved through it like a razor. Her boots clacked on wet stones, the hem of her coat damp with dew. In one pocket, the letter threatening blood. In the other, a small photograph she had not shown Elias, not yet. It depicted Beatrice Ames, 30 years younger, standing behind Agnes Cutter at a long wooden table, her hand resting lightly on Agnes's shoulder. They were smiling, but neither looked happy. The greenhouse was already open when Clara arrived. Vines spilled from its frame like secrets from a mouth that was kept shut for too long. Clara pushed through the door without knocking. The heat was immediate, humid, and suffocating. The scent of damp soil and bruised petals hung in the air. At the back of the room, in her usual wide-brimmed hat and gloves, stood Beatrice Ames, snipping the deadheads from a string of drooping lilies. Without looking up, Beatrice said, "You've come to dig, haven't you? I came for the truth." Beatrice clipped a blossom. The sound was surgical. "That's not how it works, dear. The truth isn't something you uncover. It's something you decide to live with." Clara moved closer. Agnes kept records, all of it, the names, the donations, the rituals. You were part of it. Beatrice looked up, her eyes resembling ash. "We were stewards," she said, "not conspirators." "You threatened me?" Clara said. "No," Beatrice replied evenly. "I warned you. There's a difference. I would never write something so melodramatic." She turned, calmly setting down her shears. "But others? Others might feel differently." Clara pulled the photograph from her coat and laid it on the bench between them. "Why didn't you stop her?" Beatrice picked up the photograph with a gentle sigh, as if recognizing a ghost she no longer wanted to acknowledge. "Because I was her friend," she said softly, "and because I believed she would never go that far." "Renewal failed," Clara said. "That's what the ledger says. Agnes was documenting your decline, or your corruption, or maybe both." Beatrice's hand trembled just once, then it steadied. "We were trying to hold something sacred, to preserve Grayers Ferry from what it was becoming, like the rest of the world, loud, cheap, forgettable. You built an order around silence and influence," Clara snapped. "And when Agnes wanted to speak, you turned your back." Beatrice smiled, but it was fragile. "We didn't kill her, Clara, but someone did. There it was, the subtle shift in Beatrice's face. Not guilt, not denial, but fatigue." She sat down slowly on a stool next to a pot of rosemary. "She died the way we all die in the end," Beatrice said, with the weight of her choices pressing against her chest. Beatrice looked at her for a long time. Then she reached into the drawer of the potting bench and withdrew a sealed envelope. "She left this with me," she said. "Told me to give it to you if you ever came looking." Clara took it, her breath catching. The wax was unbroken. The seal, not a serpent, but a simple rose. "She always did have a flair for the dramatic," Beatrice said. "But you should know, whatever you find in there, it won't end anything. It will just change who you think the enemy is." Clara nodded once, turned, and exited the greenhouse silently. That evening, Elias sat in the study, illuminated by firelight when Clara returned. She handed him the letter silently. He examined the seal before passing it back. "I believe it's meant for you," he said. Clara opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, Agnes's handwriting as sharp and strict as ever. "If you're reading this, I've failed in silence. The order turned inward long ago, devouring itself. The serpent always eats its tail, but sometimes it bites something else first. Jonah knows more than he's told, but he isn't the danger. Someone inside the circle broke the vow, not out of belief, but for profit. Find the old ledger. Beatrice will lie about it. And when you do, don't bring it to the sheriff." Clara looked up with her eyes wide open. "They weren't just upholding traditions," she said. "They were laundering money, or worse." Elias frowned, leaning forward. "And if we can prove it, we will not be safe." Meanwhile, Sheriff Michael Lorne poured a glass of whiskey at his desk and stared at a file left anonymously on his chair. Inside, there were 3 photographs. 1. Elias enters the crypt. 2. Clara is speaking with Jonah Crowthorne. 3. A copy of the order ledger, open to a page with a familiar name, his father's. Sheriff Lorne reached for the phone, then paused, and slowly, quietly, he hung it up again. The fog had ceased rolling. Now it simply hung, watchful, listening. And for the first time, the serpent stirred. Jonah's reckoning. The past tightens its grip, and trust becomes a currency too expensive to spend. The rain returned that morning, soft but relentless, more confession than storm the sky couldn't contain. Jonah Crowthorne stood at the wharf's edge, buried in his worn, oil-stained coat, the wind curling around him like a long-lost memory. Below, the tide lazily lapped at rotted pilings and the remnants of fishing nets left to decay. The water was gray, full of secrets. He had grown up fearing it. Now it felt like the only thing that still spoke to him honestly. He heard footsteps behind him but did not turn. "You want answers?" he said. "I told myself I'd leave before this happened, before the past opened its mouth again." Clara's voice was clear and clipped. "Then you shouldn't have come back at all." Elias stood silently beside her, watching, measuring. Jonah turned slowly, his face unreadable beneath the dark brim of his hat. "Do you know what it's like," he said, "to return somewhere, not because you want to, but because you have nowhere else to go?" "Many people leave Grayers Ferry," Clara replied. "You came back for something." Jonah smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I came back for the truth, a different kind of inheritance." He led them down the slick planks to the wharf to a boathouse that sagged like a confession. Inside, it smelled of brine, mildew, and old varnish. A single bulb swung overhead. On a workbench lay a dented, padlocked tin box. Jonah opened it with a key that had hung around his neck since he was 17. Inside, letters, dozens of them, and at the very bottom, a journal. "My grandfather's," he said. "Obadiah Crowthorne." He slid it toward them. Elias opened the leather cover cautiously. Clara moved closer, examining the cramped handwriting. Ritual notes, donation ledgers, symbol sketches. One page contained a name that froze her in place. Agnes Cutter. Initiated in 1924. Elevated in 1936. Censure recommended in 1952. "She tried to expose them," Clara said. and they silenced her. Not exactly, Jonah murmured. She didn't want to destroy the order. She wanted to restore it to what it was before, the old ways. My grandfather warned her that the others had changed, grown greedy, that she was risking more than her name. Elias looked up. And you? What do you want? Jonah fixed his gaze. To finish what they started, to burn out the rot. The letter. That wasn't a warning. Clara took out a folded note from her coat and placed it beside the journal. The handwriting belonged to Agnes. The seal was the rose. The serpent always eats its tail, but sometimes it bites something else first. Elias reread it aloud, a voice low. She wasn't just afraid, Clara said. She knew she wouldn't survive it. Jonah shook his head. She wasn't murdered, not the way you think. Agnes Cutter took her own life. The room became silent. Later that night, Clara and Elias sat in Elias's study, firelight flickering against the wall of shelves and shadows. I want to believe him, Clara said, sipping cold tea. But every time he tells us something, it's just enough to keep us close, but never quite enough to trust him. Elias nodded. His truth always costs something. I just haven't figured out what. Clara opened the journal again. A pressed flower crumbled in the crease between the pages. A note hidden inside in Agnes's scrawl. He has Obadiah's fire, but fire, when left unchecked, spreads where it shouldn't. Elias leaned forward. Maybe Jonah isn't the one we should be watching. Maybe it's who's watching him. Meanwhile, in the rectory, Beatrice Ames sat facing Reverend Lorne, her hat off and her gloves removed. She gave it to them, she said, folding her hands. Lorne poured tea with surgeon-like precision. She gave them only what she wanted them to have, he said. But it's enough, they'll reach the rest soon. Beatrice's voice hardened. You were supposed to keep this clean. Lorne smiled faintly. And you were supposed to keep them in the dark. But light has a way of finding the cracks. Beatrice stood. If they expose the ledger, they won't. Not if we act fast. A pause. And Jonah? Lorne's smile disappeared. Jonah is his grandfather's grandson. That makes him unpredictable. Beneath the rain-slicked roofs of Grayers Ferry, truths flickered like gaslight, shifting, glimpsed, but never still. And as the serpent coiled tighter, no one knew whose hand held the torch. The weight of keeping things buried, those who hid the truth begin to lose control. The rectory smelled of lemon polish and dust, as if Reverend Lorne believed cleanliness could outpace decay. The windows were kept shut even in spring. The thick floral curtains allowed no light to fall where it hadn't been earned. It was the kind of place that demanded silence, not out of reverence, but to keep the walls from remembering. Beatrice Ames sat at the edge of the parlor settee, her spine straight, her gloves folded precisely on her lap. She had not slept. The lines around her eyes, once carefully hidden beneath powder and charm, had deepened overnight. The news from Clara Whitcomb's house had traveled faster than expected, and worse, there had been talk of Jonah Crowthorne in the churchyard. They found the journal, she said, not a question. Fragments of it, he replied. Jonah's done what Obadiah couldn't, reawakened what should have stayed in the ground. Beatrice's jaw twitched. You said the ledger was burned. I said it was accounted for, Lorne corrected mildly. You assume the rest. The fire crackled between them, small but persistent like a ticking clock. Bargains made in whispered hours. "We have to move faster," she said, rising to pace. Her heels tapped against the faded rug. "Clara and Elias are too close. And Jonah, he's not looking for justice, he's looking for atonement. That's far more dangerous." Lorne watched her closely. "And what is it you're afraid they'll find?" Beatrice stopped, her eyes catching his. "You know what," she said. "We were supposed to preserve order, tradition. You promised it would stop with Agnes, that we were sealing the past, not sentencing it." He stood and moved to the bookshelf, pulling down a heavy leather-bound volume. From within its hollowed pages he drew out a folded map. Unmarked, unlabeled, but known to both of them. "If they follow this path," he said, placing it on the table, "they'll uncover more than old rights and family names. They'll find the reason why the order was fractured. And why was Agnes silenced?" Beatrice stared at the map, her face unreadable. "She wasn't the first, was she?" she asked. "No," he said. "But she was the last who thought that telling the truth would save anyone." A visit at dusk. That evening, the knock on Reverend Lorne's door did not come from a penitent, but from a threat. Sheriff Lorne stepped inside without waiting for permission, his boots wet with mud from the marsh road. "I hear Jonah's been poking around the north field," he said. "The old Smalls barn. Agnes used to keep records there." Reverend Lorne didn't rise from his chair. He simply raised one brow, the resemblance between them clearer in moments like this. "And you've come to warn me, little brother?" Sheriff Lorne shrugged. "I've come to remind you that there are still people in this town who don't want the Cutter name dragged through blood." Beatrice stepped forward. "Then stop them." Sheriff Lorne laughed, low, joyless. "You've kept the secret too long. The ground's shifting. You feel it, don't you? The town's listening again." "And what are they hearing?" Reverend Lorne asked. The sheriff's smile was faint, grim. "Not a sermon." The unraveling. Later, alone in the rectory's dim study, Lorne opened a drawer with shaking hands. Inside, beneath communion schedules and folded vestments, lay an envelope. Unmarked. He opened it with practiced calm. Inside, a photograph. Young Agnes Cutter. Obadiah Crowthorne. A third figure between them, blurred, face turned, hand resting on a book bound in serpent skin. Scrawled on the back, "We are not finished." His breath caught. For the first time in decades, Reverend Lorne bowed his head, not in prayer, but in fear. The past had begun to stir in earnest, and those who had once held the power of silence were learning what it felt like to be hunted by the truth, the shape of a false truth. Assumptions become convictions, and convictions begin to crack. The morning mist had begun to lift, but in Clara Whitcomb's mind, it settled into focus. No longer clouding her thoughts, but revealing the contours of a singular truth. She sat alone in her study, fingers stained with ink, the fireplace cold. Before her lay a stack of notes, news clippings, and the fragment of a journal page Elias had helped recover from the Smalls barn. Her eyes returned, again and again, to one sentence scribbled in a frantic, broken hand. He never forgave Obadiah, and he made sure Agnes remembered it. Jonah Crowthorne. The name rang like a cracked bell through every trail of evidence she'd followed. Agnes's cryptic will, the missing ledgers, the symbol of the three-headed serpent that had reappeared after decades of silence. he knew too much. He'd reappeared too suddenly, and most damning of all, he hadn't seemed surprised by anything they'd found. Her breath caught as she recalled the ruined rose from her garden, its stem marked in the same triangular glyph. Agnes had feared someone. Jonah was Obadiah's blood. Legacies rot from the inside, she whispered to herself. And he's here to finish what his grandfather began. Across town, a different truth. Elias Finch leaned against the rail of the Cutter crypt, his coat collar turned up against the wind. He held no notes, no photographs, only a memory. Something about Jonah had always struck him as too visible. His grief was real, yes, but there was something performative about it. And unlike Clara, Elias didn't believe Jonah was orchestrating anything. Not because he trusted him, but because he understood him. "No," he said aloud, "he's the red herring." His eyes drifted toward the spire of St. Winifred's. Lorne had lied to them about the ledger, the order, and what Agnes had confessed before her death. That alone was suspicious. Sheriff Mercer's arrival at the rectory had set Elias's suspicions ablaze. Why would the town's lawman, stoic, unyielding, and uninterested, suddenly act like a fixer? Why offer quiet warnings? Why take such careful note of their movements? Because Lorne wasn't just keeping the peace. He was keeping something buried, and Elias meant to uncover it. Fractures. That evening, Clara knocked once, then twice, before letting herself into Elias's parlor. He sat in the same armchair he always favored, a book unopened in his lap. "I've made a list," she said, pulling papers from her coat. "You need to see it." He raised an eyebrow. "That sounds ominous." "It's Jonah," she said. "It has to be. I've traced him through 4 newspaper clippings that link him to coastal disappearances between 46 and 49, minor ones, mostly vagrants. But the same glyph was found at 2 of those scenes. He's been moving this way for years." Elias studied her, his expression unreadable. "You're certain?" "Are you not?" she asked. "No," he said quietly. "I think it's Sheriff Lorne." Elias rose and moved to his desk. He pulled the unsigned warrant request he found, tucked in Agnes's papers. It bore the sheriff's office stamp, outdated but legible. "This was never filed," Elias said, "but it demanded access to the church records from 1921 onward. That's when the order supposedly disbanded, and it's signed by Lorne's father." Clara frowned. "That doesn't mean—" "It means," Elias said gently, "that the Crowthorns aren't the only ones with a legacy to answer for." A voice from the side. The knock came at 11:08 p.m. Jonah. Clara stood stiffly as Elias let him in, but Jonah didn't meet her gaze. His expression was drawn, his eyes wild with exhaustion. "They were watching the whole time," he said. "Someone's been keeping tabs on both of you, me too." "Who?" Clara asked more sharply than intended. Jonah hesitated. "I don't know, but I found this. Wedged under the boards in the Cutter crypt. It's recent." He handed them a photograph. Black and white. Clara stared at it. It was of them, Clara and Elias, kneeling over the seal on the stone near the Smalls' barn, taken from a distance and deliberately. Elias exhaled slowly. Someone's playing both sides. "And whoever it is," Jonah added, "they're not finished." Truth had taken on the shape of whoever dared to believe it first. And for Clara and Elias, so often in sync, this divergence might prove more dangerous than either realized. Because someone, somewhere in Grayers Ferry, was counting on them being wrong. The serpent's last face, the quietest man, bears the loudest sin. The storm had passed by dawn, but Grayers Ferry still wore the look of a town caught between dream and waking. Window panes were slick with rain. The muddy alleys smelled of salt and rust. Fog clung low over the rooftops, thin but unmoving, as though the town itself was holding its breath again, just not for the same reason. Inside Clara Whitcomb's parlor, everything was still. No wind, no clock ticking. Only the low hiss of the fire and the silence that grows when something has been uncovered too late. On the table, the old ledger. Elias had found it hidden beneath warped floorboards in the Cutter house. Bound in cracked red leather, its corners bruised by time, it had held a final page they almost overlooked. Faded ink, now coaxed into visibility by lamplight and heat. One name, one line. To A.L. for protecting the order when I could not. Clara stared at the letters. A.L. Elias stood beside her, motionless. Not Agnes, she whispered. Not Amos or Agnes's niece. Alden Lorne. Elias didn't answer. The sheriff's father, Clara said, as if speaking it aloud might still change the truth. Elias moved at last, drawing the curtain back an inch. The street was empty. Even the fog seemed to retreat from the revelation. He's been there from the beginning, Elias murmured. Every chapter, every record, every silence that never sat quite right. Clara's fingers brushed the cover of the ledger, and no one saw him, because he was already dead. Or so they thought. Elias turned back to the table, unfolding a brittle letter, unsigned, unsealed, but written in a hand they now recognized, Agnes Cutter's. There were no flourishes, no emotion, just a final warning. Do not bring this to the sheriff. What you're looking for was hidden long before Agnes died. Look in the place where men wait for absolution, but never ask for it. They both turned to the same thought at once. The chapel. The return to the crypt, the steps down to the crypt beneath St. Winifred's were still damp with the scent of brine and old stone. The door groaned like a wound reopened. Elias carried the lantern. Clara held the letter. But someone had been there before them. Footprints in the dust. A scent. Tobacco, faint and bitter. And a voice. You should have burned that ledger. From the darkness at the far wall, a man emerged, older than the photographs had captured. Thinner, his skin worn like thin cloth over iron. Alden Lorne. He didn't look surprised to see them. In fact, he almost looked relieved. I told Michael it had come to this, he said. Told him the truth was a storm, not something you weather, something you survive. Clara stepped back. You're supposed to be dead. He smiled, thin and sharp. Grayers Ferry has a habit of burying people before they stop breathing. Elias's voice was quiet but steady. You killed Agnes. No, Alden said. I killed what she became. He stepped forward, limping slightly, one hand trailing the stone wall like it was an old friend. She wanted to drag it all into the light. The names, the rituals, the money. And you know what happens when you shine a light on rot. He turned his eyes to Elias. Things fall apart. Clara's voice was cold. So you murdered her. He didn't flinch. I silenced her. The words landed like gunfire in the small stone room. Elias raised the lantern higher, his face tight. Why? Alden's gaze was calm. Because my generation built the order with good intentions. We protected this town when no one else would. But Agnes wanted martyrdom. She thought truth was holy. He shook his head. Truth is messy, it's unkind, and most of all, it's contagious. Clara's eyes narrowed. You poisoned her. Alden gently nodded once. She died in her chair with her tea still warm. I held her hand. A long silence followed. Then Elias asked, "And the others?" Thaddeus Crowthorne, Madeline Phelps, Amos Cutter, the librarian. Alden sighed. They were threats. Whispers become rumors. Rumors become memories, and memories can ruin everything. You were behind all of it, Clara said. The crypt, the threats, the deaths. Alden raised his chin. And still you came. His hand twitched toward something in his coat, but Elias moved faster. He pinned Alden to the wall, the old man's strength no match for years of guilt. Clara seized the revolver from Alden's pocket. It was old, loaded. How long were you planning to wait? She asked. Alden coughed, something rattling in his chest. I was hoping I wouldn't have to see it through. And your son? Elias asked. He knew? Alden's expression darkened. Michael's a good man. I asked him to bury the past, not inherit it. The arrest, Sheriff Lorne arrived just after dusk. No sirens, no backup. Just the slow crunch of gravel beneath his boots as he made his way up the broken path to the ruins of St. Winifred's. He had known where to go, because the note left on his desk that morning contained only 7 words, written in a hand he recognized instantly. He's waiting. You know where. E.F. And he knew. Clara met him near the archway, her coat pulled tight against the wind that funneled through the broken stone walls. She didn't speak right away. Neither did he. Finally, she said, "He's inside." The sheriff nodded. His eyes were hollow. He said I wouldn't have the courage. You do now? Elias asked, emerging from the shadows. Michael's voice cracked. I knew, I've always known. But knowing and saying, those are different things. He looked at Clara, then down at the chapel floor, as if trying to remember what this place had once meant. I stopped being a son the night he told me what he'd done, he said. And I've been trying to figure out what that made me ever since. Elias stepped forward. Then don't let him be buried in silence again. Lorne didn't answer. He just walked past them into the hollowed chapel, the door hanging open behind him, the fog curling at his heels. This time, the silence did not protect. It bore witness. Aftermath. There was no trial. Alden Lorne died in custody 2 weeks later, silent, expressionless, alone. His crimes are buried in redacted files and sealed testimonies. The town held no vigil, no service, just a space in the cemetery without a stone. Jonah Crowthorne left town soon after, leaving only a short note tucked into one of Clara's archive folders. I went searching for a family and found something else. You helped me see where my inheritance ends. That's enough. J.C. Beatrice Ames disappeared from public view. Some said she relocated north. Others claimed she continued secretly tending the greenhouse, hidden behind vines too dense to penetrate. Clara's garden started blooming again, but the roses she planted now were wild, tough, and untamed, and Elias Finch remained in Grayers Ferry, still walked the cliffs at dawn, still savored the quiet, but his walks often concluded near the Cutter crypt. One dusk, he stood there as the bell at St. Winifred's tolled overhead. The fog was as thin as a veil. He traced a hand along the stone. And then, softly, to no one and to everyone, he said. It's never the serpent's fangs you need to fear. It's what it sheds and what still wears the skin. Epilogue. The sea keeps its own counsel. Alden Lorne died in jail 4 days after his arrest. No trial, no confession, just a silence as absolute as the man himself. The official cause was a stroke, but no one in Grayers Ferry believed that was all. Not really. He'd lived too long with too much festering beneath the surface. Secrets he'd sealed off so tightly they'd soured in the dark. Whatever he carried, it didn't just weigh on him. It hollowed him out, slow and silent, until his body finally caved under the pressure of a life spent hiding rot. They buried him in a county plot up near Wyndham. No headstone. Sheriff Lorne didn't attend. The town returned to its rituals, as small towns do. Windows were mended. The church bell tolled again, though never quite in rhythm, and the Historical Society locked its doors for the summer, citing inventory, though Clara knew that was only half true. Beatrice Ames disappeared. One day, she was at the counter of the little lighthouse, placing an order for new hymnals. Next, her cottage was empty, and the bank reported that the mortgage had been paid in full. Some say she fled north, while others say she fled west. Clara suspected she went underground in the only way someone like Beatrice could, quietly, polished, and without a trace. Jonah was last seen boarding a bus headed out past Bangor. He left a stack of envelopes on Elias Finch's front steps. One for Clara, one for the sheriff, one unopened, addressed only to Elias. No one knows what was inside. Elias burned them all, unread. Clara stayed. She returned to the archives, to letters stained with salt and time, to names half lost to mildew and erosion. She worked mostly at night now. The light was gentler than the town, and quieter. Elias walked the cliffs at dawn, a cane in one hand, his battered journal in the other. He said the sea sounded different now, as if it too had finally cleared its throat. Most folks moved on, they always do. But Grayers Ferry kept something of the story, tucked into its bones. You could feel it in the fog sometimes, when the tide ran higher than it should, or when a gull cried out like it had seen too much. There are things the town still doesn't speak of. Not out of fear, but respect. Because when a man carries secrets long enough to die with them, the earth might cover his body. But the serpent remembers.